So, as I mentioned at the outset, the focus of this presentation is, I've called this presentation Renewable Energy Policy Pioneers. And what I want to evoke with that is that we're seeing that islands are starting to break new ground and are starting to do things with renewable energy policy that we haven't seen before, on mainland regions, and that we haven't even seen before in any island regions around the world. And that's driven by a number of factors, as we'll see. However, it means that it's less useful now for island regions to look at main countries like Germany or the US for lessons on exactly how to implement their policies, because the context of island grids, in the context of island generation costs or avoided costs, are significantly different. And that has required a better local adaptation of renewable energy policy to those island contexts. And what I've tried to do with this presentation is provide a global overview of some of what's happening in island regions to respond to that unique context. And I think it is pioneering. I do think what's happening on islands right now is very exciting and does have the potential to point the way to the future of renewable energy policy in some areas. So we'll get into that as we move forward through the presentation. So the two traditional policy options that have been used to support distributed renewables are net metering and feed-in tariffs. We're going to kick off with a focus on net metering. So net metering was introduced in the early 1980s in the United States, and it basically allowed individuals or businesses that wanted to produce their own power with the option to do so, and they could connect to the grid, to the utility grid, and be credited for their excess power. So that way, if they produced more during the day, they could use that generation when they had demand, but if the excess generation was greater than the demand, they could export it into the system. And that way it created a bit of a potential for bilateral or bidirectional power flow. You could have, the meter could roll forward or backward, depending on whether the generation was producing more than load or not. The basic principle was that the compensation rate equaled the retail rate. So it was quite simple for utilities to administer, and it allowed them simply to just, as I said, roll the meter forward or roll the meter backward for each individual net metering application. It's important to highlight that traditional net metering does not result in a cash payment. So net metering traditionally just credits customer-sided generation at a rate that's equivalent to the retail rate. So there's no cash transfer. There's arguably a transfer of benefit and attributes, but in theory, net metering just allows you to offset your on-site consumption. Excess power can normally be rolled over up to a period of about 12 months. There's different rollover provisions, but the most common is up to 1 calendar year. The second main policy is feed-in tariffs. Feed-in tariffs provide a fixed price for electricity sold to the grid under a clear long-term contract, and they typically provide guaranteed access to that grid. It's important to highlight that with feed-in tariffs, payment traditionally has been provided for 100% of the output of the system. So even if you're a household and you have a solar system on your roof, you would have an export-oriented meter and a traditional meter for your own consumption. So you're exporting power as a producer and you're importing power as a consumer. So you receive both a check and a bill at the end of the month. That's sort of the classic traditional feed-in tariff. This means that residences and businesses effectively become IPPs, or what we call independent power producers. So it had no relationship to on-site consumption. The formula, as I highlight here, is that the compensation rate was typically designed to be equal to the technology-specific generation cost. This wasn't the case in every policy. There are quite a few differences between the different feed-in tariffs around the world, but basically that's the principle at the heart of the traditional classic feed-in tariff. As you can see in the next slide, prices were locked in regardless of utility avoided costs, fuel costs, or retail prices. So the price was fixed regardless of what happened to avoided costs on the utility side of the equation. This provided, in some cases, a benefit to the utility because they had locked fixed price supply in, and they could just pay for that thereby offsetting some of their own generation, either from diesel gensets or from coal plants or any other generation source on the network. You can see here in the next slide, it's a recent report from IRENA, that the feed-in tariff price, the purple line, continued to decline, and has actually declined well below both residential and commercial power prices, the retail prices that individual customers pay. So there's no relationship between the feed-in tariff price and the retail price paid. These are two different trends. But as you can see here, in recent years, the feed-in tariff price, the generation cost of solar PV in this case, has actually declined below power prices, below the rate that utilities can generate power for and sell power for. So what you have is a situation where on-site generation or customer-sited generation is increasingly becoming cheaper than utility supply. And as we're going to see in the slides ahead, that's a turning point for the renewable energy industry in a lot of ways. And I think we're just at the beginning of seeing some of that transformation happen, and what that, I think we have yet to fully absorb what that means, both for the future of electricity markets and for the future of utilities in the broader sense. So let's take a look at these two, looking at these two circles. The traditional policy options overlap, but we haven't really talked much about the space in between. As I highlighted in the beginning, islands are unique, and looking at mainland regions and adapting policies from mainland regions may not always be workable, may not always be practical. Feed-in tariffs traditionally were designed for large mainland grids where you could inject all the power and create a more distributed power supply system. Net metering was more targeting the on-site consumption for customers that had an interest in doing so. But there's the space in between, and this is where we're starting to see innovation in islands around the world, where the traditional barriers or the definitions between these two policies are starting to break down. And we're seeing islands do stuff that doesn't really fit the conventional policy categories. So in island regions, particularly in the Caribbean, traditional net metering has led to concerns that customer-sited owners of generation are being overcompensated. In other words, if you pay the full retail rate in a country like Grenada, for example, where retail rates are over 30 US cents, you risk overcompensating those customers. In other words, creating too much of an incentive. And that has led to many customers, more customers than the utility anticipated, and in many cases, many more customers than the utility wants to connect to the network. And concerns over overcompensation also create issues for cost shifting within ratepayer classes, or between ratepayers that have a solar system and those who do not have a solar system. And that's a much more complicated issue than we can get into here, but it's important to realize that this has been a very, very real part of the debate. So what's the challenge? The challenge for island regions is to design policies that allow them to develop or encourage distributed renewable energy development in a regulated way while maintaining the reliability of the grid and, crucially, without jeopardizing the solvency of the utilities that currently supply power in that region. And for small island grids, this is not an easy square to circle. There's a lot of issues and it's a delicate balancing act to try to get those factors to line up. But as this presentation shows, there are promising examples of islands that are starting to find out ways of making that equation work. And we're going to dive into that in a moment. A quick note before I do is that this webinar focuses primarily on the compensation mechanisms, in other words, the pricing that's offered for distributed renewable energy projects. But it's important to recognize that price is only one way to accelerate or throttle the market. There are other factors that play a very important role, as many of you know, in island regions. There's the grid connection protocols. What are the metering rules? Do you need a second meter? Who pays for the meter? There are caps. In most cases, if not all cases in islands, there are quite strong policy caps on either project size, program size, or both. There's also the role of permitting procedures and grid access fees or various fixed charges. So all of those different factors are other levers that governments are using and that islands are using to control the uptake of distributed renewables on the system. But we're going to focus primarily on the pricing aspect for this presentation. So now let's dive in. As this graph shows, you can see here that the LCOE of solar PV in most areas, depending on how sunny it is significantly below both the electricity tariff and the diesel genset generation cost for a host of regions, particularly remote regions and islands. Now, this is from a recent report, the Norplan reports on remote electrification. And you can see most of them are mainland, but the same principle applies. Many of you will see Namibia in the far right, far top right, at around or nearing $2 per kilowatt hour. That is not unusual for small island systems in the Pacific, as well as in certain remote regions in the Caribbean. So those generation costs are a very real factor. And currently, distributed PV can produce power for significantly cheaper than that. Now, mind you, this is on-grid PV, the line here that's shown. So naturally, small or off-grid PV comes in at a significant premium to that, but it gives you an idea of how expensive remote supply using diesel systems is. And that creates a tremendous opportunity for distributed renewable technologies. So as I highlighted at the beginning, islands are starting to innovate, are starting to try to find ways to develop new frameworks that are well adapted to their unique context. And in doing so, they're designing things that are neither traditional feed-in tariffs or traditional net metering. They fall somewhere in between. They have characteristics that are like traditional feed-in tariffs, and they have characteristics that are like traditional net metering, but it's hard to categorize them neatly as one or the other. And that's something I want to emphasize, and I'll come back to at the end. The policy labels themselves are starting to break down, and they're becoming less useful to categorize what different jurisdictions are doing, because the innovation is happening in between, in that hybrid space. So here's the world map, and here's a brief overview of some of the jurisdictions we'll look at in this brief presentation. So I'll start from left to right. We're going to look at Kauai in Hawaii. We're going to look at Ramiyah Island in Newfoundland, Grenada in the Caribbean, the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean, as well as 3 different jurisdictions in the Pacific Islands region. So starting with Kauai. So after an earlier program was in place, Kauai updated its program and launched a new one in 2011. And it applies to a wide range of different renewables. It's not just PV. And it allows systems up to 200 kilowatts in size to be connected. And it has different capacity allocations for each project size band. So you can see there 50 kilowatts and 200 and so on. So each project size category has a certain allotted capacity. How does the payment structure work? So projects actually receive a fixed payment of 20 cents per kilowatt hour US for the net excess generation at the end of each year. So that means they roll over all the supply at the end of the year and all the demand at the end of the year at that site, and anything excess gets credited. It gets paid, not credited, sorry, paid a tariff for that net excess generation at a fixed price of 20 cents per kilowatt hour. That means that customers or prosumers, customers that are both generators and consumers, can carry their generation over, and any excess they receive an actual fixed cash payment for based on the surplus output. And that payment is actually guaranteed for up to 20 years. So as you can see, this is quite similar to a feed-in tariff in that it's a fixed payment for generation. However, it's net of consumption. So it's only for the surplus. So this falls nicely in between those two traditional policies that we discussed a moment ago. Let's move on to Ramiyah in Newfoundland. Quite a small island. There's just over 350 customers, and they recently installed just shy of a megawatt of wind power capacity, just under 700 kilowatts. And originally there was no real policy framework. It's just negotiated with the utility directly. But in that negotiation process, they ended up with something quite interesting. The payment structure is linked explicitly to avoided costs. So the formula was originally negotiated, and they basically agreed to strike a tariff that is between the utility's full avoided fuel cost and the wind power project's generation costs, up to a maximum of around 90% of the avoided fuel costs. So if diesel costs continue to go up, that could leave a significant margin of room for upward pricing for the wind power project. But the wind project costs are fixed. So it provided security that the wind power project would not, with all likelihood, fall below a certain level due to rising diesel prices, but it also provides a discount to the utility's on-site generation costs. And the 10% buffer was designed to cover any unanticipated costs, including administration. So you can see here that they struck a tariff that's somewhere between utility avoided costs and the LCOE of the wind plant that went up. And that provided a sufficient incentive for the generator, and while simultaneously providing cost savings for the utility. Moving on to Grenada in the Caribbean. Significantly larger grid. Peak demand is just over 30 megawatts. And the current electricity tariffs are now just shy of 40 cents per kilowatt hour. I think this is 2012 data. However, they had a traditional net metering policy. However, as was mentioned, it was thought that they were overcompensating producers because the retail rate was so high. So if they continued that policy, they would have likely seen far more residential customer-sided generation than they wanted. So they introduced a policy change in order to better regulate or better control the market. And they call this the Renewable Standard Offer. So there are basically two options. The first is that systems up to 100 kilowatts in size can receive a fixed payment for up to 10 years. So basically a feed-in tariff at 17 US cents per kilowatt hour. The second option they offer is that generators can choose to simply receive a payment that's based on the avoided fuel cost over the previous 12-month period. And it's not clear exactly how that formula is determined or how transparent the process is, but you can see the generators are given two different options on something similar to a feed-in tariff. This is probably closer to a feed-in tariff than the other examples we've seen so far. But you can notice in the second one that instead of it being fixed and locked in, it actually tracks utility avoided costs. And that makes it different than the classic feed-in tariff. The fourth jurisdiction we're going to look at is the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean. And they call this the net feed-in tariff program. The payment structure is that on-site generation can be used to offset consumption, so it's kind of like net metering, and they only offer a payment for excess. So anything that's above that excess at the end of the year gets paid, and a payment is scheduled to go up to 88% of the avoided fuel cost, which in the Seychelles currently means something around 17 US cents per kilowatt hour. And that will change as the avoided fuel cost of generation changes. So for the producer's standpoint, they don't have a fixed price like under the feed-in tariff. They don't have a locked-in contract. What they do have is the upside potential of diesel prices continuing to go up. And that would mean they would get an escalating tariff for their output over time. And you can see here that they chose 88% as the number. That was the result of detailed negotiations in the country, but you can see the basic principle at work. that regard, the payment structure is actually similar to Ramiyah in Newfoundland at roughly 90% of the avoided fuel cost, except that this is not just for excess generation, like in Ramiyah, it's actually only for the excess. So it's again, in that in-between space between net metering and feed-in tariffs. And it's designed to encourage businesses and individuals within the country to produce their own electricity while reducing the downside risk for the utility that they'll be overpaying. Because regardless of what their avoided fuel costs are, they'll be getting a discount to that. So in theory, the utility should be saving money and the customer should be benefiting as well. So moving across further east to the Cook Islands. You can see quick facts on the generation mix. The tariffs are currently around 60 US cents per kilowatt hour, so considered quite expensive by sort of mainland standards. And they've modified their policy a few different times. Cook Islands has been doing a lot of very interesting work on its renewable energy policy, and they have developed some interesting solutions to this. The most recent framework is more complicated, more nuanced than the previous one, and you can see that they're really trying to grapple with these challenges, this challenge of striking the right balance between how much they pay or how much they incentivize customer-sited generators to produce versus the health and solvency of the utility. So currently they have 3 different policy options for independent power producers within the country. We'll look at them in turn. The first one is a net metering, closer to classic net metering for projects under 2 kilowatts. And they get credited at the full retail rate. You can see that the retail rate is actually below the generation cost. There's no cash payment, rollover period for up to 12 months, and they get a 5-year contract. It's not clear whether they can renew or not. Presumably they will be able to, but given that this is just for small systems under 2 kilowatts, it's closer to classic net metering. In addition, they offer what they call a gross metering policy, which is for projects slightly larger than that. Depending on whether you're single phase or on a 3-phase line, you can connect up to 21 kilowatts of capacity, and it's closer to a feed-in tariff. You are paid for 100% of the power output, and it's locked in at a tariff that's roughly around 35 US cents per kilowatt hour, so quite high, quite attractive. This is still below the avoided cost of the utility, so it provides it provides a win-win situation for both the utility and for the customer or business that's developed a project. The tariff is quite attractive, so the queue it's been easy to fill the queue, and the utility is still benefiting by locking in generation that's cheaper than its current avoided cost. The third option is really more targeted at IPPs. So this is for systems larger than 21 kilowatts, and 100% of power must be exported to the grid, but the tariff rate itself is actually determined through negotiation. It will end up being below avoided cost, but the tariff is not posted publicly. Projects that fall into this category receive a bilateral contract. Each individual one will be negotiated. So you can see by creating different on-ramps or different avenues, different pathways for renewable energy development, the Cook Islands has been able to differentiate according to different customer classes. Sub 2 kilowatts of capacity for the residential, and then a category for sort of the commercial size projects, and then a third category for the larger, higher voltage connected projects. And you can see that the impacts have actually been quite positive. This graph here shows uptake up to May 2014. You can see that they're just about at 700 kilowatts installed, the majority of which is in the commercial size segment. Next, is Palau. Palau is another small island in the Pacific region, approximately 20,000 population, and retail electricity tariffs of around 40 US cents. The current payment structure that they have designed, this is just in recent months, they've established a new framework. They pay no less, the agreement is that they'll pay no less than 50% of the tariff that's applicable during that monthly billing period. Not clear exactly what that means, but the excess generation will be purchased at a discount to the retail rate. So in other words, if you have a solar system on your roof, you're exporting power to the grid for less than the power that you're buying from the grid. That means the kilowatt hours you inject into the network may be being sold to your neighbors for twice, for example, twice what you're being paid for them. The utility then has sort of the mediator, middleman fee for reallocating those kilowatt hours to another customer on that wire. And the incentive here, the design here, is to really try to minimize negative impacts to the utility. So they've created a fairly low buyback tariff, but the thinking is that that still should be high enough to create an incentive for customer-sided generation to be developed within the country. So again, you have this sort of potential for an attractive win-win opportunity. The next and last that we'll look at before coming to sort of the big picture stuff is Vanuatu. And at the end, I'll take a moment to sort of expand a little bit on what all this means. Vanuatu's framework was debated over the summer, and it has just now been launched as of October 1st. So this is hot off the press, as we say. There are two components, and it gets quite complicated. So we're going to spend a bit of time on Vanuatu because I think it has important insights packed into it. The first is something closer to net metering for residential customers, and the second is what they call bidirectional metering for both commercial and larger, higher voltage customers. And as we'll see, they compensate producers at a rate that is below retail. In other words, below the retail rate the customers pay. And if you look at the numbers, it's actually significantly below the retail rate. They also introduce caps. So this applies to to both of the different approaches. A 19.8 kilowatt system size cap is imposed based on your grid tie. So if your grid tie is 19.8 kilovolt amps, you can connect at that level with that size generator. Total capacity is limited at 500 kilowatts, and it's broken down, as you can see there. Plus, they have this interesting little limit or cap of 4 systems per local loop or transformer. So there's both kind of system-wide caps, project-size caps, as well as a loop cap, or a cap on how many systems can actually go on that local grid loop. So moving to the next slide, you can see that the grid, the actual retail rate that people pay in Vanuatu has 3 different components. There's a fixed charge based on your capacity, an access fee, that's for the systems that have on-site generation, and a consumption charge. So the consumption charge is broken down there for each kilowatt hour consumed. And as you can see, the retail rates are quite high. On the residential side, you're around 67 US cents per kilowatt hour. And we'll see why that becomes important in a moment. Under the first option, net metering, producers can export their excess to the grid under just like most typical net metering policies. And like typical net metering, there's no cash payment. So the meter just rolls forward. What's interesting in Vanuatu is that the excess generation isn't credited at the retail rate. The surplus generation is actually credited at a significant discount. It's credited at around 1/5 or 13 Vatu, which works out to around 13.5 US cents per kilowatt hour for all excess generation. And it's only used to offset what you already owe to the utility. So in other words, the fixed connection charge and the access fee. So you're already owing a certain amount of utility every month, and your excess generation is only used to offset what you already owe. Plus, as a accounting mechanism, they make each excess generation, each excess kilowatt hour, billed at a rate of 13 Vanuatu, which is significantly below the retail. So you're actually credited significantly less than the retail price for your generation, and they use that to offset what you already owe to the utility. And they're very clear in emphasizing in Vanuatu that there will be no negative bills. In other words, no cash payments to generators. The second option is interesting and has a similar design, but consumption and production are metered separately. And this is really targeted at commercial and industrial customers. There's also no cash payment, so no negative bills. It's kind of like net metering. And in the same way, they use the excess generation to offset what you already owe the utility through the connection charge and the access fee. And the rate is actually a little bit higher, significantly higher than the one offered to residential customers, because the commercial industrial rates are a little bit higher. What's interesting here is that in Vanuatu, the discount is so large. So as we saw at the beginning, if I go up a slide or two, I don't know, it's not sliding very effectively, is it? If you go up a slide here, you can see that the residential retail rate is around 67 US cents per kilowatt hour. So what they're offering is around 13 cents for any net excess generation. So that means there's a very clear incentive for customers to keep their system below a certain size. So prosumers within the small island context basically will lose any revenue that they export in addition to what they already owe the utility. So if they're hoping to make money off this, it's not going to happen. It's really only to offset their on-site consumption. And the discount is massive to what they're actually paying at the residential level. Now that should, in theory, be a very positive thing for the utility, because they're displacing very expensive kilowatt hours, and they're able to benefit from customer-sided generation by reallocating those kilowatt hours elsewhere in the network and earning a markup on them. So Vanuatu, out of all of them, is probably the most sort of utility-friendly of the different options. But because of the high tariffs, the high retail tariffs, customers still have a significant incentive to develop their on-site generation, because they can do so and displace this high amount for the actual usage or consumption charge. So moving to the conclusion, I was hoping to leave some time for questions, so I'm glad that we were able to get through sort of the big overview. And now I'll take a few moments to try to put this into context, because I realize many of you are listening from around the world and you have unique islands, unique regulatory authorities and utilities that you're dealing with. And these issues, some of what we've seen here may not be directly transferable, but I'm sure that out of the examples that we saw, there are sort of echoes of some of what you're seeing in some of your local markets. And I think some of this is, we're going to continue seeing innovation along these lines between net metering and feed-in tariffs in the years ahead. So by innovating in this sort of space in between, islands are starting to open up new ways of allowing and regulating the adoption of distributed renewable energy. And we're seeing that in a host of different ways. On the one hand, there's a desire to incentivize it, but on the other, there's an incentive for the utility to get a win-win out of it too. Because of the fact that diesel gen costs are so high in island regions and often subsidized, there's a tremendous incentive and a tremendous opportunity to reduce the avoided generation costs in island regions by increasing the share of renewable energy in the network. Now, renewable energy can be developed either by the utility, with or without donor funds, or by customers within the network, either residential, commercial, or industrial. And what we're seeing here is a shift towards policies that are more focused on allowing and encouraging customers within the network to become what we call, or what has been called, prosumers, customers that are also producers. And I think for many island regions, there's a significant opportunity to create regulatory frameworks that harness the value and the potential of those prosumers in meeting their own utility objectives, either of reducing their outages within the network, improving performance, greening the grid, moving to 100% or close to 100% renewables. There's a lot of potential in leveraging the ability of customer-sided generation to help achieve those objectives. And as I point out, there also may be some lessons in here for mainland regions. As I mentioned at the outset, it's important not to be misled by policy labels, where we talk a lot about feed-in tariffs and net metering policies. And I'll be honest, many of the islands, if you read the sort of the dictionary definition of these policies, many of the islands disregard the dictionary definition. There's no real way to categorize them. They may use the term net metering, but really what they're doing is something different. In some cases, they use the term feed-in tariffs, but actually it's not designed at all like the traditional sort of dictionary definition of a feed-in tariff. Now, part of that may be because as renewable energy policy community, we just don't have other terms to use. And that's why you see countries like the Seychelles using, they called it a net feed-in tariff. This is similar to what Australia had actually for a while, the net feed-in tariff. So you're seeing attempts to try to capture this with words, but fundamentally the labels are misleading. The important thing is to look at the actual policy structure. What does it do? How is it designed? And that's the only way to really understand what it fundamentally is. There's a common thread throughout all the islands that in areas where retail rates actually reflect generation costs, traditional net metering is seen as too generous. In other words, giving a full retail rate credit for customer-sided generation with a rollover period actually provides too much of an incentive for customer-sided systems. So there's an attempt to try to throttle that back and find ways that allow it to happen, but without being quite so favorable or quite so preferential. And you can see some of that working out in the examples that we saw, like Palau, as well as in Grenada. Taking a step back, we can see that policies are starting to be designed to compensate this sort of net excess generation in a way that saves the utility money while also allowing customers to produce power on site. And I think it's really in that sort of win-win equation that we see tremendous potential in island regions to start being more proactive on encouraging customer-sided generation in order to reduce their own generation costs, potentially reducing tariffs for customers in the process, while maintaining the overall stability and ideally the solvency of the utilities in the process. There's been a very real, a very acute concern by utilities, particularly in island regions, but also in mainland countries like Germany and in certain parts of the U.S., around the solvency of utilities. What is the future of a centralized utility in a world where distributed renewables are taking off? Is there a risk that the traditional utilities will go bankrupt? Is there a risk that they won't be able to pay back their debt obligations? Is there a risk that they'll need to be bailed out? Is there a risk that the creditors, whether in some cases it's actually owned by members that live on the island or citizens that live on the island? There's certain parts of the Caribbean where they share it via a share structure. So in those cases, there's a real concern around the solvency of the utilities. And typically, regulatory frameworks are designed to ensure the solvency of utilities first and foremost. And there's often concern that the unregulated uptake of distributed photovoltaics or distributed renewables more broadly will disrupt that utility business model and will lead to losses for utility shareholders and potentially for the government. And I think what I find most compelling and most attractive about this quick overview, this example of some of these pioneers in renewable energy policy around the world from island regions, is that there is a pathway forward. Using some of these innovations to create hybrids that can actually deliver a win-win situation, a win for the utilities, as well as a win for customers, ratepayers, and for the emerging class of prosumers in the electricity system. So I think that's really where research and analysis and policy thinking for island regions in the world needs to move, really to start targeting those win-win opportunities by creating regulatory frameworks that allow everyone to benefit. So with that, I'll close the presentation off and invite Fernando to start taking the first batch of questions. Thank you very much.